morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. We welcome you to the 2023 Rule of Law Webathon Week, which is organized by the American Bar Association International Law Section, AIJA, the International Association of Young Lawyers, the Inter-American Bar Association, and the UIA, the Institute for the Rule of Law of the International Association of Lawyers. This panel, which is presented by AIJA, is the first of our week, and it will discuss the impact of the economic crisis of the rule of law. We are one of 9 different panels being offered during this 2023 Webathon, which is dedicated to explore, analyze, and present perspectives on this year's theme, which is upholding the rule of law in challenging times. The rule of law is society's legal underpinning, guaranteeing human rights and creating economic opportunity and development. And we, lawyers, are often the first line of defense. The rule of law is not merely the stock and trade of lawyers, it is our core value. The universal commitment of the world's lawyers to the rule of law inspired us to join forces and launch this 3rd event. We are really proud to be part of it. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our panelists today. Monisha Cheong from WongPartners LLP in Singapore. Monisha is a partner in the commercial and corporate disputes practice at WongPartnership LLP. She has an active dispute practice and regularly appears before all levels of the Singapore courts, international and arbitral tribunals. She's fluent in English, Mandarin, and French, and has represented clients in a wide range of complex, high-value, and cross-border matters involving private equity, constructions, cryptocurrency, and so forth. In addition to her counsel and advisory work, Monisha also sits as an arbitrator. We then have from Angola, Neuza Melao Diaz from FBL Advogados, where she's partner since 2017. Her activity is focused on corporate, investment tax, finance, and banking law. And before joining FBL, Neuza founded LOA Advogados in 2013 and was a managing partner of this firm until 2017. Before that, Neuza worked in different Angolan law firms and also as a trainee assistant of commercial law at the Law School of University of Lusíadas in Angola. Neuza holds a postgraduate in corporate law and she's currently graduating in tax law. She is an admitted attorney at the Angolan Bar Association. We then have, directly from the Middle East, Khushboo Shahdadpuri from Tamimi and Company. Khushboo is a senior dispute resolution lawyer with Tamimi and Company. Recognized as the rising star by Legal 500, Khushboo is dual qualified in Singapore and the state of New York. She specializes in infrastructure, construction, energy, and joint venture disputes arising out of prominent projects around the Middle East. Khushboo advises and represents clients in complex, multi-party, and high-value arbitration matters. She has worked on gas pipelines, solar power plants, World Cup stadiums, and prominent real estate development projects. Khushboo has extensive experience in dealing with arbitration matters under both civil and common law, and she has also argued before prominent arbitral tribunals and the Singapore court. Last but not least, the sole man of this panel, we have Giorgio Vasvalis from Linklaters in Netherlands. Giorgio is a managing associate in Linklaters International Arbitration Practice in Amsterdam. His experience includes acting as counsel to Dutch, international, and multinational corporations, as well as states in commercial and investment treaty arbitration. Giorgio is also frequently involved in arbitration-related matters, such as setting aside enforcement proceedings before the Dutch courts. His experience also includes acting as assistant to arbitrators in commercial and investment treaty arbitration. Giorgio has previously worked for a renowned international arbitration boutique in Brussels and the legal department of a Dutch multinational. Giorgio has previously worked, is also admitted to the Thessaloniki bar in Greece and is registered with the Dutch bar. After having introduced our excellent panelists, I would like now to launch our discussion. To do that, I will start with you, Giorgio, and ask you exactly whether you could explain whether the Greek economic crisis after 2009, since you will focus on Greece, affected the rule of law in the country?
Thanks, Clara. Of course, as we all know, Greece entered a period of lasting recession and austerity in 2009, 2010. And as expected, this has left a mark on the country. It had wide-ranging socioeconomic, demographic, political implications. And as it is to be expected, this has also had an effect on the rule of law. So, for instance, as Greece faced severe financial constraints, budget cuts were imposed across various sectors, including the justice system. And these budget cuts resulted in reduced staffing levels, fewer judges, limited resources for court operations, the whole shebang. As a result, court proceedings faced significant delays and an increased duration in the resolution of a dispute. So according to latest statistics of the European Union, the duration of court proceedings has increased over time. So for example, the average duration of civil proceedings in first instance went from 185 days in 2010, so the beginning of the crisis, to 625 days in 2019. So we're talking almost a 300% increase in the duration of court proceedings, which is horrible, of course, for any person that wants to get access to justice. Moreover, next to budget cuts, the economic crisis led to more court proceedings being initiated. As you can appreciate, although the Greeks in general are very litigious as a country, the crisis pushed even more persons to secure their claims and initiate proceedings before the courts. This resulted in a backlog of proceedings. And of course, other factors have also contributed to such a backlog, such as the budget cuts that I referred to just before, but also the lack of digitalized processes in the justice system. They've all played a role in delays and the backlog in the court system. Moreover, the crisis itself led to erosion of public trust to legal processes and institutions, which of course can undermine the rule of law as well. And finally, corruption and bribery is also an important aspect. As you can imagine, corruption and bribery may become more prevalent in times of crisis as people seek to navigate bureaucratic hurdles. And Greece was not an exception to this. And as a matter of fact, experienced a decline in its ranking in corruption-related indexes during the financial crisis, indicating an increase in perceived corruption. Next to that, concerns remain regarding the appointment procedure for judges, and more specifically, the more senior positions of judges and prosecutors. And the concerns relate to the strong influence by the government in the appointment procedure and the lack of the judicial involvement in such a procedure. So all these are some of the examples, and of course we can talk more extensively. We can talk for hours about how the financial crisis has unfortunately impacted Greece. But of course there are other steps that have been made to minimize this impact, but we'll get to that in a moment.
Yeah, no, with pleasure, Georgios. Thank you very much. It's very clear examples that you gave. What has, you mentioned it before, but what has Greece put into place? What kind of measures were implemented to try to minimize the effect of the crisis on the rule of law?
The Greek government has been focusing on minimizing the impact of the economic crisis all across the board, and also including on the rule of law. So for instance, in 2021, the Greek government introduced a national recovery and resilience plan, the so-called Greece 2.0, which is a comprehensive plan developed by the Greek government in response to the latest hurdle Greece has been facing. And amongst other things, some of the key elements include the digitalization of public administration, including the judiciary. Moreover, in October 2021, the new Code of Civil Procedure was adopted, and that introduced improvements aiming to modernize civil proceedings before the Greek courts, especially with a focus on combating delays and lack of coherence in case law. So, for instance, the new Code of Civil Procedure introduces provisions for more active case management by the judges, and this includes the possibility of a case management conference, and also encourages the use of mediation and alternative dispute settlement as a means of resolving disputes. Moreover, the new code facilitates electronic filing of documents and electronic communications between the parties and the court. And of course, this aims to streamline administrative processes, reduce paper usage, and expedite communication. So hopefully all these will leave a mark on the judiciary and will expedite proceedings, and hopefully we'll get to a decreased average amount of duration of proceedings before the Greek courts. Moreover, a code of conduct for the judges was adopted in March 2022, and legislation on the promotion of judges and prosecutors and the organization of courts has been adopted by the parliament last year. Now, next to all of that, the Greek government also prioritized the fight against corruption and bribery, and that with the assistance of the European institutions and international organizations. So, for instance, the OECD, Greece, and the European Commission have launched a project to increase integrity and reduce corruption in Greece in the past years, and the cooperation seems to be bearing fruits. So there's been a new anti-corruption authority called the National Transparency Authority, which consolidates 5 different units that existed in the past. And hopefully that will lead to better and more enhanced implementation of the anti-corruption plan of the country. Next to that, provisions for the regulation of lobbying were recently adopted, and rules on ethics of civil servants are being implemented, and regular auditing activities do take place. So hopefully all that will indeed impact and minimize the effects of the economic crisis on the rule of law in the country.
Thank you, Georgios. I hope that will indeed be the case. We heard a lot in the last years the topic of the refugees and the refugees crisis in Greece. Has these also had an impact on the rule of law?
Absolutely, and unfortunately, Greece has been in the news in the past years for many reasons, including the refugee crisis as well. And this one, as one can expect, has also had a significant impact on the rule of law. So Greece has been a primary entry point for refugees and migrants arriving in Europe, especially during the peak of the economic crisis in 2015-2016. And I can give a few examples of how the refugee crisis has affected the rule of law in the country. So first of all, the large influx of refugees has overwhelmed Greece's justice system, resulting again in a backlog of applications and significant delays in the processing of asylum claims. So we do see that it takes a long while for these claims to be processed. Next to that, there's been a lot of claims of human rights violations. So Greece has faced criticism for its treatment of migrants and refugees. And of course, the facilities in the country were at the time when a country was unprepared to accept such flows. These raised human rights concerns, including issues related to access to legal representation, treatment of migrants, etc. And of course, there have been claims of pushbacks. There have been allegations of pushbacks of refugees the Greek-Turkish land border. I believe that the Greek Ombudsman released a report recently investigating allegations of pushbacks. So that is a space that we need to watch because there may be more and more developments in this field.
And are there other measures that have been taken in order to also here minimize the effects on the rule of law? Because of course, the issues that you mentioned are not of second plan.
No, of course not. And luckily enough, Greece has been focusing on all of this, and it's not all bad. I may be depicting a grim situation, but at the same time, the government is doing its best to cope, and it has indeed taken measures to minimize the impact of the refugee crisis. So Greece does get support from the European Union and international organizations, of course, to minimize such impact on the rule of law. So such examples, focus on improved reception conditions. So there have been a lot of efforts to enhance reception conditions for refugees, and this includes the establishment of new reception centers, improving existing facilities, ensuring access to basic services such as healthcare, education, legal assistance. There have been a lot of relocation and resettlement programs that basically provide funding for the resettlement and the relocation of migrants to other parts of the country where they can contribute and integrate within the country. And of course, there have been plans and integration programs for social inclusion of refugees, which hopefully will bear fruits and will allow Greece to mitigate social tensions and enhance the rule of law and create inclusive communities. So it remains to be seen what the future will be, but hopefully we're off on the right foot.
Thank you, Georges. We also wish Greece and all the best, of course. Maybe moving to Neuza now. Neuza, most of us know very little about Angola. What can you tell us about your country? I think we have a problem, a connection problem. So let's move to you, Khushboo. Middle East, we are traveling a lot during this session. Has the Middle East faced economic crisis, Khushboo? And how did this crisis lead to political instability or social unrest?
Thanks, Clara, and thank you to everyone tuning in to today's session. So obviously, a number of the Middle Eastern countries have definitely faced economic crises, and the Middle East is a large region. So I will cherry pick some examples to really showcase certain points. And I mean, I'll start with Lebanon because I think Lebanon has continued to face and combat high levels of inflation and unemployment for many years. They have been augmented by government debts and the influx of refugees that it has been hosting for more than 11 years now because of the whole conflict and ongoing wars that have gone on in Syria. And these have led to obviously widespread protests, political unrest, and put significant pressure on the country's legal and judicial system because of the lack of funds really to encourage better talent and to pay these employees properly that are working there. And if you go a few years back to really pinpoint the reason of these crises and unrest, it's so multifaceted really because at the point when Lebanon was still in a nascent stage of the economic crisis where things could obviously still be combated and curtailed, and it hadn't yet deepened to that level that was unrecoverable. It was at that point that the politicians should have reined in on spending, should have made cutbacks. But what they were actually doing was that they were doing the opposite. They were splurging on public sector pay rise because it was the 2018 elections going on. And then the government's failure to deliver all of these reforms just resulted in all the foreign donors holding back billions of dollars in the aid they had pledged. So this just resulted in a more severe economic state. And I think what's really interesting is in this Lebanon instance is the coup de grace of all of this civil unrest really was the government's idea to tax WhatsApp calls for $6 USD as a monthly charge. And, that was just unbelievable to all of the Lebanese population, which had like a huge amount of immigrants in other countries. And that's really how they were staying in touch, right? And interestingly, it's the civil unrest that sparked from this WhatsApp call tax proposal actually worked as a guardian of the rule of law, because immediately the backlash actually forced the government to then cancel this proposed tax within hours. But of course, it obviously unleashed a surge of discontent that had been simmering in Lebanon for many years. So you can see it's a really vicious cycle. And I think Georgie just had mentioned the same thing about Greece. It's the political instability leads to economic crisis, which then leads back to even more political instability. So really, it's like a chain reaction in a way. And then what's notable about the Middle East is that obviously there are some financial crises faced by the region which don't have civil unrest because the government deals with it so swiftly. The Dubai financial crisis in 2009, for example, which was caused by collapsing property prices. And I'll come back to how the government dealt with it. But really, there was absolutely zero unrest caused by this because the government obtained bailouts almost immediately and nobody really felt the effects of it. And another nuance of the region I thought it would be good to mention was that there are instances of political breakdown that have happened, which have absolutely no correlation to economic crises. So in 27, for example, some of the countries in the region actually broke off ties with the state of Qatar. And these had nothing to do with economic reasons. They were motivated by purely political reasons. And in fact, these breakdown in relationships actually resulted in economic, trade, and investment disruptions that trickled down to private individuals, to private companies. For example, there were supply chain disruptions as the cost of obtaining certain materials and items became more expensive because it was no longer possible to travel through road between these countries because all the air, land, and sea borders were closed off. This also led to the separation of families who lived between these affected countries. And there were a number of cases filed in the AIJA and the PCA for arbitration pertaining to this political crisis. So, that's really a little bit of a taste of the Middle East.
And you mentioned it before, and I know it's a very broad question, but how did governments actually deal with all these crises? Can you give us some examples?
Yeah, sure. And I think that's a really good question because, what you see in the Middle East is a sense of camaraderie with each other, a sense of social responsibility to help other nations in the regions that are facing economic crisis. And we see this between states in the same country, and we see this interstate. So when I mentioned the Dubai example earlier, when Dubai was undergoing a financial crisis in 2009, it received almost immediately a 20 billion bailout from its neighboring state, Abu Dhabi, to escape the crisis. And, this really prevented a lot of the Dubai state-linked companies to default on billions of dollars of debt. So very swift actions have been taken by the oil and gas-rich countries that form the GCC in the region. And what's really interesting is these GCC countries, which are a lot more rich in resources and richer in their economy as compared to the other nations in the region, they have this sense of duty to bail out the other nations that are going through financial crisis. So Egypt, for example, has been given billions of dollars in aid by the UAE and Saudi Arabia, along with IMF and other, obviously, international organizations. But these countries have come in first to say, okay, look, this is a country in our region, this is monies that they have handed out. And they are very cognizant of the fact that a lot of the issues faced by these countries are not completely due to internal factors. So Egypt, for example, when the Ukraine conflicts happened and the prices of grain went up, Egypt was one of the biggest importers of grain. So that really triggered a whole host of economic crises and situations because of these high prices of wheat and grain. In Iran, similar thing. When the US sanctions took place against Iran, it was not internal factors. These are all external factors that have exacerbated these economic crises faced by these countries. So being very cognizant of this, I think probably is what resulted in this UAE and Saudi governments being really amenable to hand out these billions of dollars in aid. And the solution to combat these crises, also very interestingly takes into account the status of refugees from the region. And again, going back to the example of Lebanon, where I mentioned they have an influx of refugees coming in from their neighboring state of Syria. So Lebanon recently implemented this crisis response plan in 2022. And this was a plan co-led by the Lebanese government as well as the UN. What is notable about this plan is that it takes a really integrated approach to addressing the needs of both the Lebanese community as well as the refugees that Lebanon is hosting. So there's a sense of responsibility again from the Middle East countries that these are refugees coming from our neighboring states. So we can't just say, you know, get away from our nation, we're not going to take care of you, because they do take a very consolidated approach to it. And it's quite interesting that the report didn't disregard the need of these refugees, even as the economic crisis in Lebanon reached a crescendo. And in this particular instance, it may well be because of the involvement of the UN, obviously, in this response plan. But it also could be the fact that, again, as I said, the Middle Eastern countries have a sense of camaraderie against each other, which is quite notable and it's quite nice to see. And another notable example, I thought, is the use of social means, softer ways to deal with economic crisis. Again, I'll go back to Egypt because very recently, the rising prices of meat in Egypt actually led the government to advise its people to eat chicken feet instead of chicken meat, which is very uncommon in Egypt. Nobody does that. But the fact that the government actually issued a statement to say this it just showed like the softer means of a government trying to cajole its people, which it's not very characteristic of maybe the other regions or the other jurisdictions.
I see. Thank you very much, Khushboo. Have there been any instances in recent times of Middle East nations adopting changes that are more aligned with the rule of law?
I mean, I think the most notable instance that comes to mind is Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia, as some of you may know, is gearing up towards Vision 2030, which is its goal to reduce its dependence on oil and gas and to diversify its public sectors. And this Vision 2030 has really propelled various reforms, led by its current leader, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. These reforms in Saudi actually really gained momentum from 2018 when the ban on women driving was lifted. But the reforms didn't actually stop there. It went on. Since then, Saudi Arabia has since relaxed its guardianship laws. It has enhanced the role of women, and society has granted them more freedom. And if you look back, even 5 or 6 years ago, just the feat that it's just the female labor force is taking part in is just remarkable, because now industries are hiring women in more senior positions, not just hiring more females, but hiring them as leadership roles, and hiring them in say Saudi, the army of the Saudi Arabian government, the Navy, the Royal Air Force. So all of these are important leadership roles that you can see now women taking a more direct role in. It's also opening up the foreign visitors to businesses and to investors to showcase its culture and opportunities. It's also hosting, for example, sporting events more regularly. So all of this really highlight the strong intent of the government in Saudi Arabia to open up its nation, to invite different perspectives in, and to just align it with the rule of law. We see the same trend in other nations. The UAE, even though it's a lot more modern as a country, it still has made attempts to modernize its laws even more. So a couple of years ago, the UAE has made sweeping legal changes to improve the protection of women. It has introduced loosened regulations on alcohol consumptions and has expanded the ability of non-citizens in the UAE to follow their own foreign laws on inheritance and divorce provisions. More recently, last year, the UAE introduced the labor law. So this was in February 2022, and that law actually made specific provisions to protect employees from discrimination in the workplace on grounds of race, color, gender, religion, even national origin, social origin, and disability. And all of this really goes on to show the intent of these nations to make their processes and to make their management just more fair and more transparent.
Thank you, Khushboo. So we wish it's nice to end the intervention on a positive note in this respect. I think we have Neuza back, if I'm not mistaken. So Neuza, I was saying that we know, most of us don't know much about Angola. What can you tell us about your country?
Well, Angola is a beautiful country. We have 18 provinces. We are in the sub-Saharan region of Africa. We border north by RDC, Republic Democratic of Congo, west by Zambia, east by Zambia, west by the Atlantic Sea, and south by Namibia. We have 18 provinces. Our official language is Portuguese, and we have more than 10, let's say, local language which varies according to the region of the country. We are a very rich country with vast mineral resources, as well as petroleum, that is our main commodity. And we are also rich in water. Most part of the countries in world doesn't have the level of water in rivers that we are. We have a very known forest, rainforest, that is Cabinda. It's an exclave province of Cabinda. We also very, very rich in soil, good for crops, and it's a very, very big country. So you can have an idea that in Angola territory, we fit 15 times the Portuguese that is our colonial country. We reached independence in 1975, November 1975. And the country has been ruled since then by the MPLA, that is the movement. It's a party that is came from the resistance to anti-colonial movement. We had a civil war since 1975 that ended only in 2002 with Savimbi's death. It has been a very harsh period for most of Angolans. During those years, we had very few investment in everything, social investments, a lack of investment in social services, health, education, roads. So we can say that since 2002, we are a new country that has many challenges ahead.
I see. Thank you very much. And how has the financial crisis actually impacted your country?
Very hard, because as I mentioned before, Angolan economy depends or relies most of it on oil and gas sector. That is our biggest commodity. So with the lower of the oil price in international markets, we had much lower investments in the country. We didn't have money to pay for public expenses, and it has been very, very, very hard to government and to the Angolan families to deal with all the crisis. I remember that most of persons of Angolan were not prepared to face such a hard crisis, because we are a very young country. So most of Angolans didn't have memory of being in crisis ever, or a different crisis, because we have faced different type of crisis, and most of them were related with the civil war. But economic crisis for most of us was new, because we used to see the news in relation to economic crisis in the other countries, but we didn't face it, because until 2014, the prices have been subsidized by the government. Schools and everything has been subsidized, but even hospitals. So when we started to have economic growth coming from the end of the civil war, have been hit by the economic crisis, and we were prepared to face it. So most part of the prices went high for the most part of the population. Sugar, milk, and everything that is basic for the most part of the people around the world, for us was too expensive. For example, to rent a house, normal or regular apartment, that in Europe can be rented by the amount of 800 euros, in Luanda has been rented by 5,000 euros or something like this. Has been very difficult to live in Angola with such harsh economic environment. We had long years of recession after 2014, despite the fact of from 2002 up to 2014, we had approximately 415 billions of dollars coming into states' coffers, coming from the oil sector. So all this amount of money that is huge has been mismanaged by the government, and we did not prepare ourselves for the economic crisis. Therefore, it has been very, very, very hard for us to deal with all these crises. Afterwards, when we thought that we would be recovering our economy, we have been hit by the pandemic. So it has been very, very, very hard to Angolan government to deal with all these challenges throughout the years. But something that I can say that positive in a good sense for the Angolan government is reaction to the pandemic. It has been very swift, and we immediately have closed our borders and adopt social distancing measures, and the social services and social areas have been received very support from the government. For example, private schools and schools did not stop. Prevented the increase of the prices for social system, as well the health system, even private, has been prevented the increase of the prices for oil and gas, as well the products for what we call the basic food items. So not everything is bad. Hopefully.
That's good to hear. That's good to hear, Neuza. And was there an impact of this financial crisis on the rule of law itself?
Yes.
In the legal system?
Unfortunately, yes. Because with so much low investment in social economy and social aspects of our life in Angola, we don't have, and still not going to have for the upcoming years, enough personnel to work in the judicial system. We are a lack of judges, prosecutors, judicial staff, lawyers, you name it, and we lack of it. So it's very, very hard to have justice in Angola, justice to be served properly. And it's a daily challenge. On the other side, we also face a lot of corruption and bribery, and it's very difficult to be in the judicial system in Angola. But I can say that it's not a completely flaw. Otherwise, I wouldn't be a lawyer, because I still hope that better days will come. But since not always bad news, I can say that we are facing now, from 5 to 6 years from back, we are living very good, let's say, judicial environment in production of laws, because we had a revision of our constitution. In 2020, we had the new procedure code, penal code, a new procedure, and penal code, a new procedural penal codes. We also had last year a new law for insolvency and company recovery, because these laws have been inherited from colonial era, and this is very important for us. It's a huge development. Currently, we are revising the labor law that is from 2015, but since it has a very complaints about how these laws are effective for employees, employers, and everybody. It is, although it's a very recent law, is being revised. We also have passed the new laws regarding to the BNA, that is Angolan Central Bank, as well the financial institutions laws that have been hardened the supervisory powers of Angolan BNA and has made these institutions stronger than ever and formally independent from the political powers. And hopefully we are going to have soon a new civil code and a new procedural civil code that also have inherited from the colonial area. So we hope that the rule of law in Angola, that still till today, very limited resource for the most of the Angolan, that most of us can't afford to have a lawyer. We hope to have major changes in upcoming days, but it is very hard to believe in that, because when we see that the system and the environment in relation with the laws productions is very active, we also have been challenging and facing day-to-day news about the corruption in the judicial system. For example, our Supreme Court president has been allegedly subjected to investigation related to bribery. Our president of the Constitutional Court has resigned recently after her and her son have been indicted for corruption and embezzlement. Last week has been announced a public tender for new judges for the Supreme Court, as well the name of the referees of the procedure, and at least 2 persons of this referee body has been referenced in the day after by the judges of the Supreme Court reunited in council of being envisaged in disciplinary procedures and as in lawsuits in which have been convicted to pay for the court's coffers and a huge and absurd amount of money that so how can we trust in the legal system when we see that such high persons with a high profile of this legal system are corrupt, or at least have rumors and are being investigated for corruption? Well, we still have a long way to go. And I think that despite all the efforts that the Angolan government have been doing, that is good and necessary, we still have a long way to go to end up with, or at least lower to acceptable levels, the poverty and inequality.
Well, at least Angola has lawyers like you and your colleagues to try to defend the rule of law and an honest legal system. Thank you for your explanations.
Thank you.
So we move now to a country which is completely different. Monisha, we say that Singapore is the Asian Switzerland. Has it actually already had some crises in your country, or how is it?
Thanks, Clara. Yeah, I mean, it looks like we have not had many economic crises before, to people who don't know our history well, but we actually have had quite a few crises in our short history. So for those of you who are not familiar with Singapore, we are a very small island city-state situated in Southeast Asia. We are very young. It was only in 1965 that we gained independence when we separated from Malaysia. So with no natural resources, we have an economy that is one of the world's most open economies, with our total trade being a few multiples of our gross domestic product. So that sounds really very good and everything. But the downside to this is, unfortunately, the minute that any of our major trading partners, for example, America, Malaysia, Indonesia, Japan, or China, suffer an economic downturn, we likewise are very badly affected. So if you look at our economic history, we have suffered various economic crises, and they all correspond to the time when our major trading partners also have suffered some kind of economic blip in their economies. So for example, in 2008, Singapore wasn't spared. We were hit by the global financial crisis, which had its roots in America. In fact, we were the first East Asian country to fall into a recession from the global economic crisis in July 2008. And of course, Singapore was also very heavily affected by the economic slowdown in the major economies, the supply chain disruptions, the global travel restrictions, all caused by COVID-19. And in fact, because of this, Singapore recorded its worst full-year recession since independence.
Okay, so I see Singapore too was affected by some crisis. And was there any legislative response in relation with this crisis? What were the effects of these responses, and did they have an impact on the rule of law? And if yes, positive or negative?
So I think I mentioned two crises just now, the 2008 one and the more recent one that was in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'll just focus on these two major incidents. So of course, in 2008, we remember that literally the entire world was affected by the global banking crisis. So in Singapore, the government did implement a whole slew of measures. They expanded public sector recruitment, implemented income supplements, created programs to encourage skills upgrading, gave tax concessions, increased support for all the vulnerable groups in Singapore, did a lot of public sector spending, that kind of thing. But what was really inspiring from a rule of law perspective was that before these measures were fully implemented, they were discussed and debated in full in Parliament. And the additional powers, orders, legislation that was passed and enacted was done so with full procedural safeguards. So nothing was rushed through. There was a full Parliament debate in accordance with normal procedures. And this is really inspiring because this was a period when things were really quickly moving, circumstances kept changing. And so it would have been very easy to just sacrifice the process and push the measures through. But even though it might have been tempting to do so, our government was committed to rule of law and made sure that all the things that they did, the legislation they passed, was done in accordance with full parliamentary style democracy. So I think that is how we can look at the 2008 crisis and how we responded to it. And again, of course, during the COVID-19 period, the economic crisis associated with it, our government pushed through a whole series of legislation, policies, everything, also in accordance with full parliamentary procedures. But one of the key pieces of legislation that I want to highlight, which was passed during the COVID-19 period, was something called the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act, which aimed to offer temporary relief to businesses, individuals, corporations who had been affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. So the effect of this temporary legislation was to postpone the normal running of certain contractual obligations and statutory requirements for certain types of industries, entities, contracts. So for example, the field for small and medium enterprises, financially distressed individuals and businesses, how certain company meetings that are usually required to be held to update shareholders and directors, certain construction contracts, how certain land sales, collective land sales were carried out. All these contracts and businesses and entities were caught by the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act. And you might be thinking, if all these people were affected by a legislation whose main aim was to suspend or postpone the running of normal contractual obligations, which are private contracts between two individuals, or statutory safeguards to protect certain people like shareholders, how does this square with the rule of law and Singapore's commitment to it? So there are two points that we usually look at when it comes to this. The first one is that our law minister explained that when you're looking at the economic devastation caused by COVID-19, you're looking at businesses that have been destroyed, people's lives that have been ruined. You don't really talk about contract. You talk about equity, you talk about justice, you talk about what is the right thing to do. So sometimes rule of law in the face of unprecedented global and economic catastrophe doesn't equate to non-intervention. In fact, it may even demand intervention in the interest of equity and fairness, which is part of Singapore's law. The second point is that even though there was all this legislation, there still remained an assessment mechanism. So these laws under the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act gave protection to certain groups of individuals, certain parties to certain contracts, and certain situations. So when you are in a contract, it's not just one person, there is a counterparty as well. So for those who wanted to take advantage of the legislation, and you had an opposing contractual party who did not agree that the first mentioned party should take advantage of the legislation, there was an assessor process where each party was able to present their case to the assessor, and the assessor would listen to both sides, ask for documents, ask them to state their case, and give them a fair opportunity to present their case and to be heard as well, and then make a decision. So there was still some safeguards for those that tried to take advantage of the legislation, but should not have had the benefit of it.
Thank you very much, Monisha. And what about the current period, the rebuilding era? Is the good work still ongoing in order to strengthen the rule of law, or where do you stand?
Yeah, I think in Singapore, we have been committed to the rule of law ever since our independence in 1965. And this COVID-19 pandemic has only allowed us to continue the work in an upward trend. So for example, and I'm sure this was the case across the globe, the COVID-19 pandemic brought the plight of many underprivileged groups to the forefront. Those that are financially needy, those that may not have access to the same resources as the more privileged people do have. So because of that, there has been an increased interest in Singapore in access to justice. So in terms of access to justice, Singapore has recently set up a public defender's office, which is the first in Singapore. And additionally, there have been additional steps by the main charity in Singapore that provides legal help to those that are underprivileged in Singapore, and that's Pro Bono SG. So what they have done is that they have responded to the needs of the community during the pandemic. And they have realized that there is a high demand for assistance in the legal sense from people who may not have the mobility to travel to where one of their offices are, and also who might not have, who might be intimidated by going to a place where one of the officers are. So what they've done is they've set up Singapore's first community law center in one of Singapore's areas where there is a very high number of vulnerable residents. So the law comes into their backyard rather than these residents viewing the law as an intimidating behemoth and they have to go to it and they're scared. So once with the community legal clinic essentially in a very accessible place in the community, there's been an increased uptake in legal assistance and people are getting used to the idea of, going to a lawyer for community legal help. So that has been really encouraging. And the second point that I would like to make is that, not just, we've talked about the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act. And again, it's very tempting for these kinds of legislations to be there permanently in the long run because, it makes the running of contracts much easier. But Singapore has rolled back a lot of the emergency legislation that was put in place to deal with the exigencies of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the COVID-19 Temporary Measures Act has been rolled back. So contracts continue running now as usual. No contractual obligation is suspended anymore. We are going back to the normal running of shareholder meetings and the like. And also our government has rolled back all the more personal legislation. For example, as soon as they could, they rolled back all the mask wearing requirements, the travel restrictions, and such things.
Thank you very much, Monisha. Quite encouraging, actually, the new measures put in place. Neuza, you also mentioned the impact of the pandemic. How is Angola dealing with the post-pandemic?
We are dealing very well, actually, despite all the let's say complainings about it. Our numbers, our figures are very good. We, the Angolan government, foresees a recovery of the economy. Our inflation rate has been estimated in 15 points. Our interest rates have been lowered 1% by the Angolan BNA, the Angolan National Bank. We have a forecast of growth of the economy about 2.35%, and we have evaluation, not devaluation, evaluation of the Angolan currency for 12 consecutive months. So we are very good at this moment. We haven't been so good for many years. Currently, we don't face any kind of constraint to transfer abroad money to pay for our obligations, legal obligations, and our reals are superavit, so we have money to pay for our debt for about and importation for about 6 to 12 months. So for a young country, our figures in these aspects are very interesting.
That's good to hear, Neuza. Really.
Yeah.
Gordon, in the Middle East, how was the COVID-19 crisis dealt, and were there any particular factors or pre-existing vulnerabilities that actually made measures more effective on certain groups?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're running out of time, so I'll try to keep it quite short. And I think generally speaking, the region dealt with the impact of COVID-19 quite effectively. And a lot of what Monisha said applies to the Middle East as well. So the rights of an individual were balanced versus the society's rights in general. So travel restrictions, when they were imposed, were balanced against the ability of nations to monitor and contain positive cases through early vaccination and through mobile applications. But one thing good or one thing positive that resulted from COVID-19, if anything at all, was the investment that the Middle East governments did towards the healthcare sector. And this was previously a sector that wasn't as prioritized in the region. So countries actually managed to upscale their health systems to respond to the outbreak. And obviously, post the COVID-19 pandemic, it will result in better facilities for these nations as well. But some few interesting things on pre-existing vulnerabilities. I think the region has quite a bit. And the first pre-existing vulnerability, I think, comes from the huge income gap in the MENA region. And I think the top 10% of the population actually controls 64% of the country's or the region's wealth, making it the most unequal globally. And that's what the data and statistics show. So because there's such a wide gap of between the incomes, the sanitary crisis was obviously exacerbated, and the vulnerable groups were more disproportionately affected in the region as compared to the other regions. And another pre-existing vulnerability, I would say, would be the long-standing conflicts that some of the regions have, which have greatly weakened the capacity of those states to provide proper healthcare. So Iraq, for example, is still suffering from the effects of war that's ongoing and its fragile infrastructure. There's fires, 2 major fires actually happened in April and June 2021, killing at least 200 people and burning these critical hospital facilities. So that country was left with very little hospital to care for COVID-19 positive patients. And in Syria as well, the result of ongoing wars have reduced hospitals and primary care facilities by up to 40%. And this is a big number. Even bigger than that is the fact that many workers in the healthcare sector are actually refugees in other countries, so they're not able to provide care to their own people. So these are some things we see in the Middle East, which have obviously contributed to the effects of COVID-19 being disproportionately felt. I think another pre-existing vulnerability would be the sanctions that some of the countries are facing. For example, Iran still facing sanctions from the US, and that has really limited its ability to access vital equipment and medicines. And something similar happened in Beirut. There was a big port explosion in August 2020. It was all over the news, and the reason why it happened is still unknown. There was a little bit of some government's faults or some mismanagement of the facilities, but that explosion also reduced the hospital capacity of Lebanon by over 30%. So these factors, I think, are a little bit more characteristic of the Middle East region that have contributed to the impact of COVID-19 being felt disproportionately. But having said that, I think generally speaking, the governments have dealt with it quite effectively, and it's still continuing to do so. So it's quite positive overall.
That's good. It's nice to end on a positive note. Maybe just a last word from you, Monisha. It's true that we are running out of time, and but there are so many questions I would have still, but we need to short it down. Monisha, I understand that Singapore continue to try to work in favor of the rule of law, putting efforts in this respect. Are there any reasons for this energy that is put in this topic?
Yeah, I think, if we're going to end on a positive note, we can end with this question, because I think for Singapore, we accept the rule of law as a universal value, and we recognize that it is the foundation on which our country was built and provides the framework for its proper functioning. So from 1965 till today, the rule of law is something that we try to abide by, and try to do that in all areas of our economy, our justice system, and our aspirations.
Thank you. Well, listening to you all, I have the impression that there are efforts that are done in all the 4 continents to try to respect the rule of law and work towards a perfect system, if it ever exists. So thank you for joining us to this panel. Thank you to these great and outstanding speakers for all their inputs, which were absolutely interesting and extremely precious. The Rule of Law Webathon Week does not end here. There is another session that is starting very shortly at 2 p.m. GMT. And you can register to this session by simply clicking on the link that you have in the chat. So thank you very much. Thank you to the 4 of you for your inputs and explanations, which were very precious. And I wish you all a very nice day and a very nice Webathon week.